and perform the funeral rites becoming of a great hero. When Caesar was done mourning his old partner and one-time son-in-law, he turned to the ministers who had engineered the assassination. They were in big trouble. Alexandria had been founded in 334 BC by Alexander the Great, and since that time, it had grown to become one of the most important cities of the ancient world, nearly as wealthy and populous as Rome itself. When Alexander died, his domains had been divided up by his former captains, with Egypt going to the general Ptolemy, and since then, the Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled the Nile from the growing cosmopolitan capital of Alexandria. The Greek-speaking Ptolemies made no effort to integrate with the locals and rarely left the safety of their palaces. But with the death of Ptolemy XII in 51 BC, the ruling dynasty was fractured. The dead king had decreed that his son and daughter ought to be co-rulers in the Egyptian tradition. But the same court ministers who would later assassinate Pompey had decided that the 10-year-old Ptolemy XIII would be far easier to control than his 18-year-old sister Cleopatra, and so worked diligently to marginalize her power. But Cleopatra was savvy, and, seeing that she was the target of palace intrigue, did something totally radical. She turned to the local Egyptians for support. She became the first of the Ptolemies to learn Egyptian and often took part in the local religious festivals in her role as queen. By ingratiating herself with the locals, the queen became even more dangerous to the ministers controlling her brother, and so, by the time Caesar arrived in Egypt, a full-blown civil war was underway, with Cleopatra exiled from the capital, leading an army of local Egyptians. But at that time in Egypt, support from the locals did not count for nearly as much as support from the Greeks in Alexandria, so her position was dicey at best. And this is why it had been such a huge mistake by the conspiring ministers to kill Pompey. It caused Caesar, in his disgust, to turn away from the young king they controlled and look for other allies in Egypt to support. Cleopatra fit the bill perfectly. So, rather than return to Rome and begin consolidating his power there, Caesar announced his intention to stay in Alexandria and settle the civil war. But placing an ally on the throne was not Caesar's only reason for staying in Egypt. His endless campaigning was expensive, and he needed money. With the rise of Rome, the Ptolemies maintained the independence of Egypt by issuing massive bribes to influential Romans, which in time included Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. Caesar reminded young Ptolemy XIII that the last round of payments promised by his father had in no way been forgotten just because the old king had died. Ptolemy's ministers did everything they could to try to convince Caesar to leave, promising payments as soon as he was back in Rome, but Caesar would have none of it. He was more than content to wait for payment, and in the meantime, he could help them solve their little civil war. I'll bet they were thrilled. He called for Cleopatra to return to the royal palace to help sort out the conflict. But knowing that if she were to simply appear at the gates, it was likely that her brother's allies would have her killed before she could make it to the relative safety of Caesar's company. So she famously hid in what amounted to a laundry bag and had a loyal slave smuggle her into the palace. Caesar was immediately taken by the cunning fashion. Declaring only to be executing the will of the dead Ptolemy XII, Caesar re-elevated Cleopatra to co-ruler, and not long after, the 21-year-old queen, for reasons of either politics or affection, became Caesar's mistress. The powers behind Ptolemy XIII, however, were not going to take this lying down, and concluded that they were going to have to expel the Romans by force. Caesar had brought with him to Alexandria only a single understaffed legion of some 4,000 infantry and around 800 cavalry. Reinforcements were on the way, but they were weeks out. So if the ministers were planning to drive Caesar away, they knew they needed to do it before the rest of his army arrived. So they whipped the local Alexandrians into a frenzy, declaring that Caesar was planning to make Egypt a province, depriving them all of the liberty and wealth to which they had grown accustomed. Nearly the whole city rose up in revolt and besieged the royal palace, which was held by Caesar and his men. What followed was weeks of bitter street fighting, as Caesar was forced to try and conquer and hold the neighborhoods around the palace, house by house, block by block. Nothing in their long careers prepared the Romans for the rigors of urban warfare. The cavalry was useless, and traditional troop deployments were unworkable. Their only advantage was that they were tougher and more disciplined soldiers than their opponents, and were able to withstand barrages from the locals as they moved to eradicate pockets of resistance. Eventually, the Romans leveled whole blocks to create a no-man's land the Alexandrians would be suicidal to try and cross. The ticking clock was at the forefront of the Alexandrians' mind. While Caesar needed only to hold out until reinforcements arrived, the Alexandrians needed to win before the reinforcements arrived. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break the Roman resistance. Caesar was able to maintain access to supplies by winning a naval battle in the harbor, but suffered casualties he could not afford in an ultimately successful but brutal assault on Pharos Island, home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria. Finally, though, in January of 47 BC, word came that the Roman reinforcements had completed their overland march and were now on the outskirts of Egypt. Caesar slipped his besieged men out of the palace under cover of night, and along with a contingent of Cleopatra's Egyptian army, joined with the newly arrived legions to form an army of some 20,000. This combined force assaulted the base of young Ptolemy's army, which numbered around 20,000 itself. Used to fighting severely outnumbered, facing an army nearly equal in size was a rare treat for Caesar's legions. The Battle of the Nile was easily won by the Romans. Ptolemy XIII drowned when the ship he was escaping on capsized, and Cleopatra was placed back on the throne. Caesar, though, never had any real intention of annexing Egypt. The wealth of Alexandria, combined with its now thoroughly anti-Roman citizenry, would prove a fertile center of rebellion no matter how loyal a governor Caesar installed. Better to leave it as a client kingdom with Cleopatra in charge. The queen understood that she owed her position to Caesar and Caesar alone, so he knew she might be the one person on earth he could trust not to rebel the first chance she got. But official province or not, Egypt was now firmly under Roman control. The Hellenistic dynasty of the Ptolemies that had ruled since Alexander the Great was, for all intents and purposes, broken. Rome's full encirclement of the Mediterranean was nearly complete. Because I left Caesar in such desperate straits at the end of the last episode, suffering through the winter with half an army deep in hostile territory, this week I think he deserves to be left in a slightly better place. So we'll leave him there in Egypt where, despite the fact that the remaining senatorial forces were regrouping in Numidia, the fact that Mark Antony's ruthlessly debauched management of Rome was turning the city into a hellhole, the fact that his appointed governor of Spain was so corrupt and brutal that the natives so recently won to Caesar's banner were in revolt, and the fact that nearly every territory Rome had ever pacified was planning to declare its independence at the first opportunity, Caesar took a month off in early 47 BC to enjoy a leisurely cruise up the Nile with Cleopatra. Next week, Caesar will go back to the exhausting business of consolidating power over the Roman Empire, but for now, let's leave him be. I think he's earned a vacation. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 45, The End of the War. In early 47 BC, after settling the civil war in Egypt and firmly establishing Roman dominance over the Nile, Caesar took a month-long cruise up the Great River with Cleopatra. Though no doubt relaxing, it was not simply an uncharacteristic vacation. Caesar took with him some 400 ships. The slow-moving entourage was meant to display the power of Rome to any Egyptian who may be planning resistance to the new regime. Caesar had a dozen major problems to deal with as he reshaped the political map of the ancient world. He did not need a revolt in newly pacified Egypt to become one of them. Of those major problems, his greatest lay near the remains of old Carthage, where the senatorial forces that had fled from Pharsalus were regrouping under the command of Metellus Scipio, who was building a massive army with the help of the Numidian king Juba. The problem was in fact
spoke
so big
several times
that Caesar knew he could
before
not
about
face it right away.
ideological subversion.
His
That
men
was
were
a phrase
exhausted,
that,
the cash supply was
upgrades
running
some Americans
dangerously
don't fully
low,
understand.
and the entire eastern
When,
half of the empire
the Soviets
seemed ready to
used the
revolt at a
phrase
moment's notice.
ideological subversion, what do you
Plus,
mean by
between the Battle of
Ideological
Pharsalus and the war in
subversion
Alexandria,
is the
he had
slow
basically
process
lost contact with Rome
which we
itself.
call either
The population,
ideological
who had
subversion
once received
or
regular,
active
glowing
measures
reports
at
from
the
Caesar
illegal
during the
being
Gallic
active
Wars,
in the land of
had now gone more than
domination,
6 months
or
without any
psychological
updates
warfare.
at all.
What it basically means
Before
is
he could face
to
his
change
enemies
the
in North
perception
Africa,
of reality
Caesar would have to
of
solidify his
every
hold over every other
American
corner of the empire,
to
including the
such an
capital
extent
city
that
itself.
despite of the abundance
So,
of information,
rather than marching west, Caesar
no
took the
one
road
is able
east out
to
of
come to
Alexandria.
sensible conclusions.
His plan was to travel
In
up
the
the
interest
eastern
of
Mediterranean
defending
coast across the Adriatic into Italy.
It's a great
Along the way,
brainwashing,
he would collect money,
process
allies,
which goes
soldiers, and
very
support,
slow, and it's
and he
divided
would
into
eliminate
4 basic
anyone who
stages.
opposed him. For the most part, though,
First
there
one
was no
being
opposition.
demoralization.
Kings who had been
Takes from
clients
15
of
to
Pompey
20
readily
years to
embraced Caesar
demoralize
as
the
their new
nation.
patron.
Why that
Roman
many
garrisons
years?
scattered across the
Because
east,
this is
most
the
previously
minimum
allied
number
with the
of
Senate,
years which requires
repudiated their old generals and
educate
begged
one
clemency from
generation of
Caesar,
students
who was more than happy to grant
in
it.
the country of
But it was not all
enemy,
easygoing.
exposed
Pharnaces
to the
II,
ideology
the son of
of
Rome's old
the
enemy
enemy. In
Mithridates,
other words,
had
Marxism
returned to
Leninism
Pontus and thought it
ideology
right that he
is
should be
being
king.
pumped into the soft heads
But to
of-
stake his
of at
claim,
least
he had
3
been forced to
generations of
battle with the
American
Roman
students
garrison
without
stationed there to
being
keep an eye on
challenged or
Caesar's interests in the
counterbalanced by
region.
basic values
The Roman
of
garrison,
American-
distracted by a
American
desire to
culture.
make for Egypt to reinforce their
The
embattled general,
demoralization
had not taken the
process in the
fight
United States is
seriously,
basically
and Pharnaces
completed
had beaten them
already.
soundly.
For the last
Now, in the great
25
game of
years,
power politics,
actually
Caesar
it's
might have let this
overfulfilled
go and
because
worked out a
the
deal with
demoralization
Pharnaces
now
to
reaches
recognize
such
his
areas
sovereignty over
where
Pontus in
previously
exchange for not
even
making
comment
trouble.
on drop of- on
But
all
upon his
these
ascension to the
experts
throne,
would-
the new
would
Pontic
even
king had made a
dream
point to
such a
track down any
tremendous
Roman citizen he
success.
could find
Most
and
of it
castrate
is
them.
done by Americans
This was
to
a crime
Americans,
that Caesar could
thanks
not
to
let
lack
go
of moral
unpunished.
standards. As I mentioned before,
So as he traveled through Asia Minor,
exposure
Caesar
to
humored the
true
Pontic envoy
information
sent to
does
work
not
out a
matter
lasting
anymore.
peace. He replied with
person who
kind
was
words and generous
demoralized
promises,
is
but it was all
unable
merely a
to
show to
assess
buy
true
himself some
information.
time as
The
he marched
facts
toward Pontus.
tell nothing
The
to
speed
him.
with which Caesar moved took
Even if
Pharnaces
I
off
shower
guard,
him with
and before he knew it,
information, with
Caesar was at his
authentic
doorstep.
proof, with documents, with
When the Romans
pictures.
arrived, though, Caesar's
Even
tone
if I take
immediately
him by
changed.
force to
There
the
would be no
Soviet
peace
Union
with a
and show
man
him
who castrated
concentration
Roman
camp,
citizens.
he will refuse to
Pharnaces,
believe it
who thought he was on the verge
until
of a deal with
he
Rome,
is going to
quickly
receive
assembled
a
his
kick
army
in the
as Caesar
teeth,
dug
his
in
head
outside the
bottom.
hill fort of
When the
Zela,
military
where the
bull
Pontic king was
crashes
holding
his
court.
balls, then he will understand.
The only
But
hope
not
for
before
Pharnaces
that.
was a
That's the
surprise
tragic
attack
situation
before the
of
Romans were
demoralization.
firmly entrenched. So at
The
dawn,
next stage
while the
is
legionaries dug
destabilization.
trenches, the
This
Pontic army
time,
poured out of the
subverter
gates of the
does
fort.
not care about your
At
ideas
first,
and the
Caesar
patterns
could not
of your
believe that they were really
consumption. Whether you
attacking,
eat junk
but it
food
was
and
soon
get fat
obvious
and
that this
flab,
was
it
no
doesn't
bluff.
matter anymore.
Throwing
This
aside their
time,
shovels,
and it takes
the
only
Romans
from
tried
2
to
to 5
assemble as the
years
enemy
to
army
destabilize
hit.
a nation.
In the din of battle, it took longer than
It's-
usual for the
what
legions to get
matters
their
is
act together.
essentials.
But once some
Economy,
order was
foreign
imposed on the
relations,
battle,
defense
the Romans
systems.
quickly gained the upper hand.
And you
The
can
Pontic
see
army was
quite clearly
destroyed,
that
and
in
Caesar
some
let his men
areas,
sack the town.
in such sensitive
Writing to a
areas
friend
as-
in Rome,
as,
Caesar described the
defense
campaign in Pontus simply,
economy.
I came,
The
I saw,
influence
I
of
conquered.
Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely
Caesar
fantastic.
continued
I
west through
could never
Greece without
believe it 14
incident,
years ago
and soon
when I
enough landed on the
in
shores
this
of
part
Italy.
the world, that
There to
the
greet him in
process will go
Brundisium was
that
Cicero,
fast.
who had gone home after the
The
defeat of
next stage,
Pharsalus,
of course, is
and was now
crisis.
ready to
It
face
may
whatever
take
punishment
only
Caesar
up
had
to
in
6
mind for
weeks
him.
to bring a
But
country
Caesar,
to the
who
verge
had
of
tried his
crisis.
whole career to
You
win
can see it in
Cicero over to
Central
his side,
America now.
merely embraced the
And
old
after
senator
crisis,
and asked him to
with a
join him on
violent
the final
change
leg of his journey
power,
so they could catch
structure,
up.
and economy, you have so-called the period
Back in
of
Rome,
normalization.
Caesar's first order
that
of
lasted
business was
indefinitely.
removing Mark Antony from power.
Normalization is a cynical expression.
While he had been on
borrowed from
campaign in the
Soviet
east,
propaganda,
Caesar had
when
been
the Soviet
appointed
tanks
dictator
moved
by what
into
was left of the
Czechoslovakia in
Senate,
68,
and Antony had been
Robert
made
Brezhnev
master
said,
of the horse.
"Now the situation
And
in
legally,
brotherly
when the dictator is
Czechoslovakia
absent,
is normalized."
the word of a master of the
This is
horse
what will
becomes
happen in
law,
the United
and
States
Antony
if
had
you
let
allow all
absolute
the
power
schmucks to
corrupt
bring
him
the country to
absolutely.
crisis.
While Caesar had
promise
refused to
people
revive
all
the
kind of
horrifying
goodies and the
prescriptions that
paradise
had
of
marked the
earth,
reigns of Marius,
to
Cinna, and Sulla,
destabilize your
his chief
economy,
lieutenant showed